Well, we're coming to the close of another liturgical year that at the end of November begins the first Sunday of Advent, which is a new year for us in terms of the liturgy. It's funny when people talk about the liturgy because we're getting ready for that now too, and as we were getting ready I kind of slipped and hit my chin a little bit, so my apologies for that. But it's interesting when you talk about liturgy to people today because people have such a varied experience of the celebration of liturgy itself. It's almost as though everything depends now upon the personality of the priest or the whims of the priest. For example, some people would say, oh, I like going to Father's Mass because he's so funny. Or I like going to this priest Mass because he's intellectual. Or I like that Mass because they say the Mass in Latin. And a bunch of other reasons that people go to Masses. Now they're not going to Mass to adore the Lord. They're going to Mass searching the priest or the personality of the priest. You could almost hear people saying that. And so that's a bit of a problem because I don't think that was ever really the intention of the reform of the liturgy. Now, any good student of Catholicism should spend a little time on the history of the liturgy, particularly in the last century. Everybody forgets that we went through a Second World War. And that was very catastrophic because these were wars made in Christian lands, mostly Christian lands for the most part. And the church begins to ask the question, particularly it reflects about the Holocaust, how can it be possible that in lands where Christ is proclaimed every day, such atrocities can occur? Pope John the 23rd was one of the first one who did something about it. He called the Second Vatican Council. And normally councils are called upon to declare doctrines, but this one was a pastoral council. Paul saw and understood that the church needed a reform. The church's message is not being heard, and we can tell because of what we're seeing in terms of the violence that there was in the world at the time. And so the reflection was, how is the gospel not being heard? Now, one of the students there was a bishop called Karol Wojtyła, now John Paul II, and he picked it up. He understood exactly what the council was about, and even his pontificate was about bringing forth a new evangelization. He wanted to bring the gospel to the people in a fresh, new way, and his efforts were very much missionary oriented. But also another student that was there was, back then, Father Ratzinger, who later would become Pope Benedict XVI. And Pope Benedict XVI is very much marked by being a scholar of liturgy. And he noticed now that after Paul VI Mass in 1969, where the priest is now facing the people, before then the priest was celebrating ad orientem, which means he was facing towards the east. In other words, facing the altar. He wasn't giving his back to the people. He was praying the Mass with the people facing east. And the reason why is because the Mass was more considered a sacrifice. It was the sacrifice of Calvary. In Mass versus Populum, the new Mass that we have now, it's more look like, or it's focused on it being a meal, a communal meal type of thing. But the problem with that is that now the priest is the center of the attention. Now the priest, his personality, his way of celebrating things, what he puts on and what he doesn't put into the liturgy, the attentions he puts into it, now become front and center stage. In fact, they even put the tabernacle onto the side. So who's really at the center of the prayer here? And so Pope Benedict XVI thought and beautifully imagined, he said, well, after 50 years, let's take a look at what's happened to the life of prayer in the church. And once again, what they're looking at is not so much how we pray to God as much as how does God want to be worshipped. And so Pope Benedict XVI allowed both traditions to live side by side. They're both traditions of the church, versus Populo and ad orientem. It was the way the church adores God. And so in this new way, trying to bring newness to the church, we have to continue the reflection. And so he allows priests to celebrate the Mass in both forms. Pope Francis, on the other hand, hasn't had much to say about the liturgy other than he's taking on what Pope Benedict XVI is allowing. We have to take a look at the tradition. We have to take a look at the early history of our church, particularly in the area of liturgy. The church needs to go back to its early springs in order to bring freshness and newness to the worship life of the community. Once again, as a church, we're not concerned about how we uniquely pray to God as much as we ask, how does God wish to be worshipped? And the more we can do that, the more we can bring people to prayer and in union and communion with God.